Hi, this is Steve from Nothing Venture Nothing Game, here to go over the second new class out of the new Dark Archive book released for Pathfinder Second Edition, published by Paizo. It is the Thaumaturge. So the Thaumaturge is the second of the two classes in the new Dark Archive book. The first one, called the Psychic, was more focused on internal mental fortitude and using a mind to cast magic, while the Thaumaturge is more designed with very little, if not any, spell casting involved, and more on knowing occult information about your enemies and exploiting that information. So the first things first, if you've seen any of these class review videos before, we're going to go over the initial proficiencies to see what you get. And then we're going to kind of go over what the whole thing about the Thaumaturge is, because it is quite a unique class. We'll go over a couple of feats, and I'll kind of give you my final thoughts at the end. So the first thing is, unlike the Psychic, you only have one choice of key ability score, and it's going to be Charisma. Everything is based on your Charisma. You're going to get 8 hit points per level, plus your Constitution. You are expert in Perception. You're expert in your Fortitude saves, and you're expert in your Will saves, and you're trained in your Reflex saves. You get trained in all 4 magical tradition skills, which is Arcana, Religion, Nature, and Occultism. You also get 3. You also get 3 skills plus your intelligence modifier and skills of your choice. You're trained in simple and martial weapons and unarmed combat. You're trained in light and medium armor and unarmored, and you are trained in your Thaumaturge class DC. And you actually also get an additional lore skill, which we're going to touch on as one of their features. So one of the key things we're going to be talking about is what makes a Thaumaturge special. And the one thing that makes a Thaumaturge special, above all else, at least in my opinion, is the implements. Now, as a Thaumaturge, you're going to select over your career several implements that give you different actions or reactions that you kind of focus your energy into. Whereas the Psychic focuses their internal mental energy into magic, the Thaumaturge focuses their internal energy and knowledge about creatures and a knowledge about weird stuff into their variety of implements. Now, there's a variety that you choose from, and over your career, you're going to be able to select 3 of them, some of them which will be improved over time. The next thing is you're going to have an implement. Now, over your career, you're going to have multiple implements, and there's a variety to choose from, and at high levels, you're going to get a maximum of 3, and some of these are going to be improved over time. They give you special actions and reactions, and sometimes passive benefits, depending on which ones you've selected to improve. And there is, let's see, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah. Okay, there are 9 different implements, and they vary from amulets, an amulet, a bell, chalice, lantern, mirror, regalia, tome, wand, and weapon. And depending on which ones you choose will kind of give you different actions or reactions that you can take when you are wielding these implements. So generally, when you select an implement, you are granted that item. It's a mundane version of that item. And since you're the one powering it effectively, powering it, putting your own mental, you're putting your special juju on it and your special rituals and all your kind of mental energy and all your occultism knowledge, and you're kind of marking, you're making these things your own. So when you really can't sell them, they're not worth anything to other people, they're worth something to you. And same thing is, if someone else picks up one of your implements, that doesn't do anything for them except the fact that they have a worthless, mundane item in their hands. But to you, it is a very powerful object. So you have specialized, powerful implements, and along with that, you get what's called Esoterica, which is kind of smaller, more common shavings of garlic, essence of garlic, shavings of silver, partial parts of a holy symbol, wood from a special tree. And you have all these different variety of items on you, and which are required to activate certain abilities, but they're not defined. You can define these as you are. It's more like partly of what you've collected over time, what you've found works against certain creatures. So think of it like a spell component palette. So the components in it aren't necessarily defined. They're defined as you define them. But you constantly carry and collect very smaller mystic objects, bits of materials with paranormal affinities, and items used in folk practices, which become your Esoterica. These might include cold iron nails, scraps from scrolls and scriptures, fragments of bones of a purportedly from a saint, things like that. These are things that are mystical in nature, but aren't necessarily magical, that you use to kind of power some of your abilities. You're always assumed to have access to your Esoterica, and it's just assumed to be on your person, unless there is a situation where you don't have any of your items. Say you're captured and all your stuff is taken from you, you're implied to not have it, so some of your abilities may not work. They get exploit vulnerability. Now, to talk about exploit vulnerability, we have to talk about a special lore skill that the Thaumaturge gets access to. The Thaumaturge gets access to what's called esoteric lore. So esoteric lore is a lore skill which differs from all other lore skills, as in most lore skills based on intelligence. But your esoteric lore is based on your charisma modifier. So you're going to get your bonus to your primary skill is charisma. You're probably going to be putting your highest or next highest stat in charisma. This lore skill is based on your charisma, which is a good thing because you're going to need a lot of your abilities focused on making this lore check, whether for free or as a part of another action. That it's important to have this pretty high. And over your time, unlike normal lore skills, this lore skill improves on its own as you level up as a Thaumaturge. So the exploit vulnerability is a one action activity. It does have the manipulate trait because you are holding your implement and you're doing kind of complex hand motions with your implement. And you can only do this once a round. And this goes back to making one of those esoteric lore checks that we talked about earlier. You retrieve an object from your Esoterica. Remember what we talked about before. This is part of the action, where as part of the action, you have your implement in your hand. You kind of like messing around with some of your implements. Maybe you're pulling out some of that shavings of silver, or maybe you're like throwing some garlic in the air. Whatever you have to do. And you retrieve the object from your Esoterica with the appropriate supernatural qualities. Then use your implement to stoke the remnants of its power into blaze. You select a creature that you can see and attempt an esoteric lore check, and it's a DC of the standard DC of your level. So as you get higher and higher level, your esoteric lore is going to get better and better, but the DC is going to get higher and higher. As you retrieve the right object from your Esoterica and use your implement to empower it, you gain the following effects of exploit vulnerabilities. So depending on if you crit succeed, fail, or critical fail, you'll have a variety of results. So if you critically succeed, the GM tells you all of the creature's weaknesses, resistances, and immunities, including the values of these resistances and weaknesses, as well as certain vulnerabilities. Say that there are certain golems that are immune to certain types of magic or vulnerable to a certain spell. You will learn that information with a critical success. So when you critically succeed, your unarmed and weapon strikes also become magical if they weren't already. On a success, you only learn the highest weakness of the creature, or one of its highest weaknesses if there's a tie, but not any of its other weaknesses, resistances, or immunities. And you can exploit the weaknesses. And like I said, we're going to go over that in just a second. So on a critical succeed and a critical success and a success, you can either invoke a mortal weakness, which is a weakness that it possesses, or a personal weakness, which we're going to get into that in just a second. But on a failure, you only are able to invoke a personal weakness, which, like I said, once we're going to touch on that, it's going to make sense. And also, you also want a failure. Your weapons are treated as magic if they weren't already. On a critical failure, you couldn't remember anything. You couldn't remember the right object to pull out of your Esoterica, and you kind of got a little distracted when you're like, "Oh no, is it this one? No, it's got to be this one. No, maybe it's third theme." So you're kind of confused, and so what happens? You become flat-footed until the beginning of your next turn. So it's not, it's not great, but it's only flat-footed till you're beginning your next turn. So remember, you can only try this once a round. So if you have a critical success and a success, you can invoke one of two weaknesses. A mortal weakness is after identifying a creature's weakness, you can use a thematically resonant part of your Esoterica to empower yourself to be able to do that kind of damage. Even though your weapons aren't actually doing that type of damage, so say you're fighting undead, and you know that they have a weakness to positive damage. Your weapons don't actually do positive damage, but you're treated as if you did that kind of damage. So you're going to invoke that weakness. So if you're going to hit and do 1 point of damage, they're going to take their weakness of 5 or 10 or whatever it is on top of that. And that's just how you're going to get all your bonus damage. This is where a lot of your damage is coming from. It's not necessarily your weapon strike. Your weapon strike is going to do damage, but you're also, if you're successful in your exploit weaknesses, you're going to be able to invoke the weakness of a monster, a weakness that the monster has. This damage affects the target of your exploit vulnerability as well. So if you pick the mortal weakness, so say there's 5 zombies or 5 skeletons out there, and you use your exploit vulnerability on one of them, and you know that they have a mortal weakness, and you succeeded or critically succeeded, and you have the choice of a mortal weakness, one that they already have, or a personal antithesis, and you pick the mortal weakness, your weapons do that weakness damage to all of those enemies, all of the skeletons. Doesn't work on the zombies that are over there, but it does work on those skeletons. So you don't have to target each individual skeleton with this ability if you pick the mortal weakness. So this is the benefit of picking a weakness that the monster already has, is that you don't have to keep trying on every single type of that creature. It works on the entire group of monsters that are there in the fight. New fight, new monster, new check. But in the current fight, those 5 skeletons, you don't have to roll for each 5. You rolled once, you succeeded or critically succeeded, and now your weapons do that bonus damage, and are treated the monsters are treated as weak to your attacks. This damage affects the target of your exploit vulnerability as well as any other creature of the exact same type, but not other creatures with the same weakness. Like I said, skeletons it works on, all 5 skeletons it works on. Those 2 zombies over there, you're going to have to make a new check for them. And you can only have 1 exploit weakness going at a time. So this works until you do it again. For example, when fighting a pack of werewolves, you might use silver shavings or a crushed moonstone to deal damage that applies the weakness to the silver to your attacks against the werewolves, but it wouldn't apply the damage to any other monster with a similar weakness to silver. So the other option here is using a personal antithesis. So either you failed and you don't have the choice to use mortal weakness, or you succeeded, but maybe the creature doesn't have a weakness. Maybe it's a human or dwarf or an elf or, some other bad guy, a goblin or whatever it is that may not have an associated weakness to their character. So you don't have a weakness. You don't have a mortal weakness to pick from. You can then improvise a weakness on the creature by forcefully presenting and empowering a piece of Esoterica that repels it on an individual level. For instance, against a tyrant, you can procure a broken chain that once held one of its captives. The target creature, and only the target creature, so this is different than the mortal weakness. The mortal weakness has the benefit of targeting all the creatures of the same type. All those skeletons, this is affected by, but say, like I said, you failed against that group of skeletons, so you have to pick the personal antithesis. That one person that you targeted, that one skeleton, you're going to have something that is more personal to that skeleton that the other ones are not going to be affected by. But that is one skeleton that you use the personal antithesis on is going to gain a weakness. You're going to give it a weakness for a short time. And it gains a weakness equal to your unarmed and weapon strikes equal to 2 plus half of your level. So the way weaknesses work, when damage is calculated, after you calculate all your damage, if the monster is weak to it, it adds the set number on top of it. This is how weaknesses work. So if it has weakness silver 5, and I hit it with a silver weapon, it's going to do whatever damage I do plus 5. And that 5 is added after all the stuff. After all crits and all multiplications and all that math is done on your end, the weaknesses add on top of that. So weaknesses are multiplied on crits. You're with the personal antithesis, you're generating a personal weakness to that one monster. And like I said, it's half your level plus 2. So if I do 5 points of damage and I have my personal antithesis on you, it's going to do 2 plus half my level extra damage on that creature. Remember, once that creature is done, or once I use exploit weakness again, that weakness is going to fall away, and then the new weaknesses, I'm going to be able to pick a new weakness, either a personal weakness if they don't have one, or if I rolled high enough and I use a mortal weakness, it's going to have that whatever weakness they have. The power of your implement, we haven't talked about implements yet, but we're going to get into that in just a second. But the power of your implements can use to be mundanely empower your attacks. If you have an implement in one hand and a one-handed weapon in the other, as a part of a strike, you can use your implement and use some complex gestures to kind of empower your strikes. And you're going to get 2 points of damage on top, 2 points of damage on your strike per weapon die. So as you get a striking weapon, you're going to get an extra 2 points of damage per weapon die that you get. If you're holding anything in your hand, with the exception of a one-handed weapon, your implement, or your Esoterica. If you're holding anything else in your hand, you have a potion, you're about to drink it, you can't use this. So like I said, the implements are various items of power that you've kind of made personal and kind of infused them with your power and rituals and knowledge and experience. Maybe you've carved some runes into them. And they're special to you. Some of these are very defensive and supporting to your other party members, and some of them are very offensive, and some of them are kind of utilitarian. So there's a lot of different options here, and I do like the fact that they gave you, I think, seven different types of implements, and they kind of vary wildly in what they do. Let's go. I think when we did the playtest, we talked about the Chalice, so we can talk about the Chalice again. Actually, you know what? We're going to talk about the bell because I think the bell is kind of cool. That reminds me of the old Gargoyle show when they made a cold iron bell to fight the bad guys. One of the implements we're going to talk about is the bell, which I think is a kind of a cool concept of like you ringing a bell and it causes some effect that could be harmful or helpful. So you gain the ring bell reaction. So the trigger is the target of your exploit vulnerability makes a strike or casts a spell that would affect you or one of your allies. The requirements is you're holding the bell. Obviously, you have to be holding the bell because how you ringing it if you're not holding it. And the trigger is the target of your exploit vulnerability makes a strike or casts a spell against you or an ally. And the requirement is you're holding the bell and they have to be within 30 feet. And the triggering creature, so the person casting the spell or attacking, making the strike, has to be within 30 feet of you. So there's two different types So this depends on whether they're casting a spell or whether it's a strike. So there's two different versions of this reaction that you're going to get. So they're both under the ring bell reaction, and you either get Distracting Cacophony, which is the trigger was a spell. You create a musical crash of sonic energy that assails the target and breaks its concentration. The target must succeed a fortitude save against your class DC or become stupefied 1 until the end of your next turn. If they critically fail this save, they're stupefied 2, which is pretty brutal. The target doesn't have to make a flat check. So, to those who don't know, stupefied means if you try to cast a spell while stupefied, you have to make a flat check based on your stupefied level to see if you even just mess up the spell completely. You also take a penalty to your intelligence, charisma, and wisdom checks and DCs while stupefied. So your DCs are lower. So the target doesn't have to make a flat check against this triggering spell, but future spells they would have to. But the attack roll or the DC is appropriately lowered based on the stupefied value of the creature. So if they're casting a spell and they use your reaction, and it's a spell that you have to make a save against, it's 1. The DC lowers by 1 or 2 if they critically fail. If they're making a spell attack roll against you or somebody nearby you, their attack roll is reduced by 1 or 2 if they've failed or critically failed your save. Immediately stupefying someone casting a spell at you is pretty good. Disrupting Harmony is the other version of this. Disrupting Harmony is if they make a strike against you or someone within 30 feet. The trigger is a strike. You create a strangely discordant harmony that sinks into your foe's mind and throws off their movements. The target must succeed a will save. So this is kind of funny. So it's a fortitude save if they're casting a spell, and a will save if they're physically fighting you. A will save against your class DC or become either enfeebled 1 or clumsy 1, your choice. Or enfeebled 2 or clumsy 2 if they critically fail to save. So enfeebled is strength based and clumsy is dexterity based. So you're either going to select enfeebled or clumsy. So these conditions are similar. Enfeebled affects strength-based checks, which include attack rolls based on strength-based weapons, strength damage rolls, and anything that they're going to make a check against that uses strength. Mostly it's going to be athletics. Clumsy, on the other hand, affects dexterity. So they're going to take minuses based on their value, the clumsy value, -1 or 2 in this case, based on all their dexterity checks, their AC, any dexterity saving throws, and their reflex save. So it's pretty good. And remember, this happens until the end of your next turn. So there's going to be time for because they're enfeebled or they're clumsy, especially if they're clumsy, it's going to lower their AC, which makes them easier to hit for your allies. So that's useful. So it's very much it doesn't just affect you, it affects other people. So with the second implement we're going to talk about is the mirror. And partially it's because I want to make a Total Recall reference.
You think this is the real Quaid? It is.
But other than that, I think it's really cool. So the first implement we talked about, the bell, gives you a reaction. The mirror gives you an action you can take on your turn. The initial benefit is you learn how to use your mirror to project another version of yourself whose realness is a matter of perspective. You gain a mirror reflections action, which is an illusion. It's a magic effect. It is a manipulate, so someone can trigger attacks of opportunity. Requirements: you're holding the mirror, right? You have to be holding the implement that you're using to use any of these. To use a specific implement, you have to be holding that implement. Back to mirror's reflection, because this is just dope. It literally is a scene from Total Recall that this happens in. You reflect an illusory image of yourself into an unoccupied space within 15 feet that you can see. You are treated as being in both places until the start of your next turn. For example, you can attack, seek, and provide flanking even to yourself. You occupy both spaces. So this isn't like a mirror image effect. I mean, technically it is, but you are honestly in both places at once. But there are some restrictions. Your mirror self mimics your actions exactly, but any effects that generate only come from from one of the two positions. So say I'm playing a Thaumaturge with a one-handed crossbow or a javelin, right? And I have my mirror and I activate my thing. Right now I'm two spots and I throw my javelin. Both images are going to mimic throwing a javelin, but the javelin's only going to come from one spot. So obviously now you're pretty sure which one is real. Anything that targets or would be affected, the reflection affects you and uses your statistics. Anything that would affect or target both of you affects you only once. Meaning if you get hit by a fireball or some sort of area of affectability, because you're in there twice, it doesn't mean you get hit twice. You can only get hit once. When you move, if you choose to move while this effect is active, you choose where to move from. So in essence, you're going to get an extra 15 feet by spending an action being able to be in two spots. But then once you move, the effect ends completely. So you can't move while you're doing this effect. So some effects force you to determine which image is the real you. And at the end of that effect, your mirror effect will end. So once you've determined where you're actually standing, if an effect is requiring you need to determine where you are right now. And once that effect is resolved, the mirror person will fall away because everyone knows where you are and the effect is no longer there. The higher level benefits can add, so the adept and the other effects can add other conditions to where this effect will end. But just keep in mind, this is the base effect. The adept benefit is if someone tries to attack you, while the mirror reflection is in effect, when the enemy adjacent to one of your spaces damages you, that version of explodes into a shard of mirror, into the mirror shards, and explodes and does damage to people. This ends the effect, obviously, because they know where you are and your mirror just exploded. And it deals slashing damage to all creatures within a 5-foot emanation around where your mirror self was. The damage is 2 plus half your level, or the damage of the triggering attack, whichever one is lower. So if your damage is, say, 5, and you only get hit with 3 points of damage, it explodes in 3 points of damage. So whichever one's lower. You are immune to this damage. You happen to be standing pretty close to your mirror. Maybe you put it next to you just to give yourself a chance of avoiding some damage. It attacked the mirror part of you. The mirror part explodes. You don't take this damage. You're immune to your shards of your own mirror. And like I said, all these implements have a thing called Intensify Vulnerability. Depending on which implement you kind of have active at a time, there's an action that you're going to get at 7th level called Intensify Vulnerability. And each implement's going to have a different way where you can actually intensify the effect. Whether it's a benefit to you, whether it's a detriment to your enemy, they all have a little bit of variety baked in there. On the third one we're going to talk about is the weapon, because we all love doing damage. I think the tome is pretty interesting too, but like I said, we're just going to talk about the weapon because, it's a weapon. Why won't we talk about the weapon? The weapon implement is one of the most direct and confrontational, representing battle, struggle, and potential violence.
God's gift. The violence.
We all love potential violence because, hey, we're all in this game to fight monsters. Like I said, if you're picking weapon as your implement, it must be one-handed. Yeah, the cool thing about this is you can hold your weapon as an implement and another implement. If you really wanted to, you can kind of have two implements going at once. Remember, a lot of these either cost a reaction or action, so having multiple implements out does give you a minor benefit of being able to have them both out and have the options of maybe a reaction from, say, your amulet or your bell. Maybe you have that reaction that we talked about, and then you also have your weapon out, so you can do stuff with your weapon. So the cool thing about this is you get the implement's interruption reaction, but you also at 5th level gain the critical specialization for your weapon if it's your implement, if it's one of your implements. So this is like slight benefit versus, because I don't believe that the Thaumaturge actually gets access to critical specialization unless it's their implement. But the implement's interruption is an evocation effect. It's magical, and obviously the Thaumaturge is doing it. The trigger is the target of your exploit vulnerability uses a concentrate, manipulate, move action, or leaves your square during a move action it's using. Requirements: you're holding your weapon as your implement and are benefiting from exploiting vulnerability against the creature. The creature must be within your melee reach or within 10 feet if you're using a ranged weapon. Remember, it doesn't say that you had to pick a melee weapon. So your weapon senses the moment of weakness and guides your hand to strike down your foe. You make a strike against the triggering creature with the weapon implement. If your attack is a critical hit, it disrupts the triggering action. The strike does not count towards your multiple attack penalty, just like most reactions don't count towards your multiple attack penalty, and it doesn't apply your multiple attack penalty to it. This basically gives you attack of opportunity reaction. It's slightly more powerful than attack of opportunity, but it requires you to have already taken an action earlier to exploit those weaknesses. But also, this could mean you can use a hand crossbow to interrupt people, which is actually quite good. And so a normal attack of opportunity is only manipulate and move actions or leaving a threatened square. This one includes concentrate. So if you're just mentally thinking about something, the Thaumaturge can detect it and whap you one with his weapon. And like I said, if you were just trying to move or do whatever, you interrupt the action, wasting that person's action and making them have to try again. So then we've gone over a couple of the implements. We kind of got a feel. We can take an implement that benefits others. We can take an implement that benefits ourselves, like the mirror, or we can take an implement that is very combative, like the wand or the sword or the weapon. Doesn't have to be a sword; it can be a weapon. Wand is a different one. And you take the weapon, which is very much a confrontational piece. But I don't, based on what I read about all the different implements, there's no right option. This gives the Thaumaturge the ability to build in a variety of different ways and to get very different feels. We would think of fighter or barbarian. Barbarian is like, look, I'm all about getting mad and doing damage. How I do damage, that's a determination of what options I picked. We want to talk about fighter? It's what weapons I'm really dealing with. Am I going for a big two-hander? Am I going for a range? But I'm still all about fighting. But the Thaumaturge can be as much of a support character, using its actions and abilities and weaknesses to shore up damage that it doesn't have, maybe because it picked supportive options, or can very much take the very offensive ways of doing damage, and that's in the way that it could support other people. But it also has other implements. Remember, you're going to have 3 over your career, probably 2 or 3, depending on how high you get. So you can kind of dabble into a couple of different versions. Like maybe you want to have your weapon as like your primary implement, and that's going to be the one you're going to be doing the most with. Or you're going to take the bell or the mirror and you really want to talk about positioning and doing weird stuff. Or maybe you take the Chalice and you want to try to heal people. The Chalice is still kind of a healing option where you can kind of give people temporary hit points. You can kind of heal people. So the variety here is really nice. Now we're going to go down to the feats. Like you talk about the implements really define your character. The feats really kind of really focus in what your character is really going to be good at, or it can kind of make you more general thaumaturgs if you're kind of focusing on multiple implements and kind of a variety of methods of play. Given the fact that the Thaumaturge is very much a non-spellcasting class, they do have options to either get free. They actually get things called temporary items. Well, they preface that. The Thaumaturge can get things called temporary items. This is very similar to the alchemist when they make their potions for the day. Those are temporary items. You can't make a potion based on your class and sell it to somebody and get money. And this is not infinite money. The Thaumaturge has several feats that grant them temporary items during their daily preparation. One of them is Scroll Thaumaturgy. Actually, that's not actually through a Scroll Thaumaturgy. So the Thaumaturge is very much a non-spellcasting class. They don't get any innate spellcasting, but they are involved in the idea of spellcasting. And that is reflective in the feat selection that they get. So they can actually, normally, if you're a non-magic person, you don't have any access to cast a spell activity at all through any of your classes, any of your selections. You normally can't pick up a scroll and just cast it. You can't really activate a wand. You don't have the access to the cast spell activity. But if you want that, and you want to mess with scrolls, the Thaumaturge can actually take a feat at first level that takes the Scroll Thaumaturgy feat at first level, can actually cast spells off of scrolls for any tradition. And actually use your class DC for the DC for the spells if it has a DC. You can draw and activate scrolls with the same hand holding an implement, much like you can with Esoterica. Now, there are advancement feats to this where they actually granted temporary scrolls that you gain access to at 6th level. We're going to go through this feat line because I think it's kind of interesting. The next feat in the line of that Scroll Thaumaturge we talked about is Scroll Esoterica. Let's see. So your Esoterica includes scraps of scripture, magical tomes, druid markings, and others of the like that can be used as temporary scrolls. Remember, we talked about temporary items before. These can't be sold. No one else really can use them. But you kind of like can use like bits and pieces of scrolls to kind of makeshift your own spells. Each day during your daily preparation, you create a single temporary scroll containing your first level spell of any tradition. This must be common, or you must otherwise have access to that spell. This scroll is unstable temporary items. This scroll is an unstable temporary item that loses its magic the next time you make your daily preparations. Just like all temporary items, you can't sell them. At 8th level, you gain a second temporary scroll containing a 2nd level spell. And then there's more advancements that you can keep getting more and higher level scrolls that are all temporary. So if you really want to add magic to your Thaumaturge, there's a way to do it. Which I think, and yet again, spells have a variety of uses, and this really opens up the ability for the Thaumaturge. And yet again, it's implied that it's an implement. It's a part of your Esoterica, so you can keep it with your same hand that you're using your implement with. So you have your weapon implement, and you pulled out a scroll, so you can use the same hand. So the number of hands could be an issue if they didn't kind of write in these extra rules that let you kind of use the same hand for multiple reasons. They can get free talismans, just like they make temporary scrolls. They can get free talismans, and then there's improvements on that, which basically every day they can make up a couple of talismans, and actually is an option for them to be able to put 2 talismans on the same item, which is not normally allowed. There's also improvements to your exploit vulnerability, whether that's granting your exploit vulnerability to other people or whether that's improving your vulnerability to yourself. Like there's a sympathetic vulnerabilities. While you have mortal weakness applied, that's the one where you know that they have a weakness and you're basically saying, my weapons do that damage. So basically those skeletons, they're weak to positive energy. All of a sudden your weapons all are treated as if doing positive energy. Or maybe that werewolf and your weapons are treated as silver. Your strikes also apply to weakness to any creature that shares the same weakness, but it's not the same creature type. Remember, if I make my exploit weakness check against a skeleton and I succeed or critically succeed, I'm going to be able to apply that weakness with all of my attacks to all the skeletons because they're all the same creature type. This allows me to apply it to those zombies too, because the zombies share a weakness with the skeletons, and now it doesn't matter. So now I'm able to apply. I know that it's the same juju and whatever implements and reliquaries and esoterica that I've used to empower my weapon against the skeletons will also work against those zombies, or then maybe that vampire over there. So yeah, so it's not any additional action. It's just a feat at 6th level called Sympathetic Vulnerabilities. That's a solid choice. Here we go. At 10th level, Share Weakness. It's a 1-action activity. The prerequisites are Exploit Vulnerability and Mortal Weakness. So remember, they have to have a mortal weakness. You can't use one of those implied weaknesses, which is the personal antithesis. You have to have gotten the mortal weakness, which is either you succeeded or critically succeeded on that check when you tried to exploit vulnerability. You are exploiting a creature's vulnerability using mortal weakness. You select an object from your esoterica that has great personal value to you, such as a locket or a treasured ring, and you grant it to your ally. Establishing a personal link between you that allows your ally to affect the enemy as if they were you. The ally strikes apply a weakness of your mortal enemy's weakness in the same way your strikes do. This benefit ends when your exploit vulnerability ends or you share weakness again. So you exploit weakness. Okay, now I know they're weak to positive energy. And you shout to your buddy, hey buddy, that ring that I gave you, it starts glowing. And my ring glows, their ring glows. Now we both have this weakness that we can target the monsters with. If I decide to say all the skeletons are gone, so now I have to switch targets, I exploit weakness again. Maybe it's the same positive energy and I didn't realize it. So that I didn't know that thing was a vampire. Now I realize it's a vampire. Now, okay, positive energy will work against that vampire. But since I exploit weaknesses a second time, the share weakness will drop off until I take the action again. But it's still good. So you're able to share out your basically, your one shtick is this whole weakness concept and the exploit weaknesses. And now you're able to share it to one other person. And there's one final thing. So I like the fact that the Thaumaturge is as much about items, whether that's items coming from their esoterica, whether it's those little trinkets that they have, whether it's their implements, whatever implements you decided to pick, or those are their temporary items or other magical items that you're going to accrue over time. So things like double activation or intensify investiture really go into the fact that the Thaumaturge is really about knowledge in general. So they not only know just about those creatures, they don't know just about the occult lore behind certain things. They don't know just about, weird ways of mimicking magic, like those scrolls or those talismans. But so things like one more activation at level 6, you're able to use one of your items an extra time beyond its normal listed frequency. So most of the frequencies that we're going to be worried about, we're not worried about the once every 10-minute ones. Maybe you really desperately need to use that twice in a combat, and you can use it in here. Once a day, you can kind of like get a little extra out of the item and use this item beyond its normal frequency once a day. Or maybe you have those healer's gloves and you use that earlier in a combat to save somebody, and they were almost done, and you healed them and brought them back into the fight. Well, now you've used it once a day. Well, one more activation, you kind of know how to like get the little extra juice out of your items and use kind of like your deeper bond with the invested items that you have, and it has to be an invested item. And you can activate it one more time beyond its normal listed frequency. But then you also have things like Intensify Investiture. The bond of each invested item enables you to put more of yourself in the item. So a lot of times items list a DC. So if it's let's take Ring of the Ram. So Ring of the Ram is a ring that you can use 1, 2, or 3 actions, and it basically has a giant ram that pushes somebody and punches them and does damage. But it has a listed fortitude save of DC of 22. Now, at 6th level, this is a 6th level item. 6th level, it's good. What happens if you're 10th level? 12th level? Right? And this feat's actually available at 12th level. So once you start getting higher and higher levels, the flat DCs on a lot of these items cease to be effective. What the Intensify Investiture allows you to do is it allows you to put your class DC instead of the listed DC of any invested items that you have. And this is a free action. You can only do this once every 10 minutes. But still, your bond with an invested item enables you to put more of yourself into them. If your next action is to activate an item that is invested and it has a saving throw, you can use your Thaumaturge saving throw instead of the listed one, which may make useful items that were not useful anymore because their DCs were too low, which basically even one would pass in some cases because the item is too low. Maybe you haven't gotten around to buying the upgraded item, or maybe even if the upgraded item, that maybe the DC is past its prime. So I think this is a really a good choice, and it shows that the Thaumaturge isn't just, okay, I am this one class feature and that's it. They kind of have a lot of different little features that kind of go into it, but they also show that based on certain options you pick, you can basically make a quite versatile Thaumaturge and use invested items and trinkets and free scrolls and your implement and your weaknesses and combine them all together to make a very effective character, whether that's effective in healing and providing support for your party, or whether that's making you a significant threatening combatant, or just coming up with a shortcoming. Maybe your group doesn't have a healer or doesn't have that arcane character. You can kind of supplement it. I mean, they're not going to be as good as a straight wizard or sorcerer or another arcane class, but they can come up with some shortcomings that maybe your group is lacking. So I think the Thaumaturge is in a great spot. They have a lot of different options and a lot of different variety in how they can be built and how they can be played. What do you all think about the Thaumaturge? Is this something that you've been looking forward to? Is someone in your group thinking about playing it? Is it something you guys are not even interested in, at all playing? Or do you really have that really interesting weapon plus chalice plus amulet Thaumaturge? You're just going to go crazy. But this is Steve from Nothing Venture, Nothing Gamed. May all your die rolls be crits, and may you always roll max damage. See you later.